friends, welcome back to the channel. So we're doing our January wrap up, and I gotta say, January was a fantastic reading month for me. I read a ton of books, and mainly because they were shorter books, novellas, shorter novels, a lot of middle grade. And that's because at the end of last year, I was really slumpy. I was just kind of fed up with everything that I was reading for the most part. I did read a couple of things that I did enjoy in the fall and winter, or early winter, I guess I should say. But I really got back into my reading in January. And reading shorter books is something that I really like to do. When I'm in a slump, I just pick up things that are really easy to read and that, you know, I know that I'm gonna enjoy, really cute adventures, and there was lots and lots of that here. So a little bit of everything. There's adult horror, middle grade, YA, nonfiction. So I'm gonna share all of my thoughts on these 16 books with you guys. So earlier this month, I did speak about some of these books that I had read as part of the Scary Sleepover weekend. So I'm going to go over those ones again, but just very quickly because I've already done, you know, the big part of my thoughts in that video. So I'll have that one linked down below if you guys want to go check out that one as well. That was part of the Scary Sleepover weekend that was hosted by Alex the Bookubus, and I had such a good time with that. So besides everything that I went over in that video, starting right at the beginning of January, I read a book called The Gravedigger by Edgar J. Hyde, and this is part of the Creepers series. So this is kind of a middle grade, I guess you would say probably older children's into middle grade series. So I hadn't heard of this series before, the Creepers series. And I think if I end up picking up any more of these, I'm really going to enjoy them. It was a super cute story that I read on Audible. So here we follow the Price family. So it's a father and his two kids, Jamie and Paula. But they also have other members of their family. So the father writes horror stories, and their extended family is made up of a blood-phobic vampire, a vegetarian werewolf, a headless ghost, and an Egyptian mummy. And so the entire family moves into a house that's, you know, within the grounds of a graveyard. And that was right up my alley because most of you guys know I grew up in a haunted Victorian myself, which was right across the street from a graveyard. So this brought me back to that. It was very nostalgic. And they meet an old man named Ebenezer Crim. Now that's a name for an antagonist for sure. And Ebenezer Crim is the groundskeeper. And he doesn't really like the Price family very much. I won't get into why because I don't want to have any spoilers. But he's trying to get them to leave. And they're doing everything possible to stay. But it has some disastrous results and they find themselves in a little bit of a pickle. So this was fantastic. I gave this book, I think, 3.5 stars. I had a lot of fun with it. It was just a couple of hours long on Audible, so I read it kind of within an afternoon. And definitely, if I find any more of this Creepers series, like at the secondhand bookstore or anything, I would definitely read more of these. So if you have middle grade kids at home or you're a kid at heart, I would definitely recommend checking out this series. And the next book that I read was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. And this one I also listened to on Audible. And you know, there's the Disney version of Ichabod Crane, The Legend of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, I think it's called. And then of course we have the Tim Burton movie that was made in 1999 where Ichabod is actually a constable, but in the original story he is a school teacher and he's very quirky and awkward and, you know, all of that sort of thing. So this is of course the classic story of how he goes to Sleepy Hollow and Katrina Van Tassel, he falls in love with Katrina Van Tassel, and he is teaching at the local school there and encounters the legend of the Headless Horseman. So I mean, we all know the story. I don't know if a lot of people have read the original or they just go off of the interpretations and just, you know, handed down of kind of the ins and outs of what happens in the story. But I have to say I was actually really surprised with how this one ended because it's such a departure from, you know, the adaptations that we know really well. But I gave this one 4 stars. It was a lot of fun. I loved the language. It was very poetic. It was very haunting to listen to. So I actually put this one on when I was cleaning off my bookshelves, actually. So every few months I take everything out of the shelves and, you know, give them a good wipe down, and it was fantastic to put on them in the background and just have a listen to the original story the way that it was meant to be interpreted. And then I did talk about these in my Scary Sleepover Weekend wrap up as well. So I read the Creepover books. You're Invited to a Creepover by PJ Knight. So I read 5 of these out of the series. I have another stack that I have to get read because I did promise to send these to a friend. So I read the first 4 in the series: Truth or Dare, You Can't Come In Here, Ready for a Scare, The Show Must Go On, and then book number 10, It's All Downhill From Here. So I spoke in length about these, like I said in my last video, but I hadn't spoken about this one, and it turned out to be my favorite one out of the 5 that I read. So this is The Show Must Go On, and it is about a haunted play. So the play itself is about a sleepover, and it has this like ghost that's trying to come to the sleepover because before she was killed in real life, she always wanted to go to a sleepover, but she was never ever invited. And then the play itself ends up being cursed, and the ending is kind of crazy, and it has like this alternate plane kind of going on. So this one was really interesting, and I have to say these books are so cute. They're a really great introduction to, you know, the Fear Street or any of the series that we know really well. And I have to say, I think I enjoy these stories even more than a lot of the Goosebumps ones. And I know that's probably a really not a popular opinion, but I'm so enjoying my time with these ones. They're great little adventures. They're really spooky in a lot of cases. Like this was kind of terrifying, and the girl that's the main character here, she gets the lead role in the play, and she kind of starts going through all of this stuff, and she thinks she's gonna die because she's cast as the lead character, and this whole thing. And a lot of the endings of these books are really surprising as well. Some of them have great twists, some of them are kind of weird, and like there's alternate realities going on and all of this stuff. So I would really highly recommend, if you have kids at home, to pick up the Creepover series. I got these for just a couple of dollars on Book Outlet, and they're really, really great. So like I said, I read 5 of these, and you know, I would just sit down with one of these with my morning coffee and just read through it. They're all about, you know, 130 pages or so, but of course the font is really, really big and lots of space and stuff like that. So really super quick reads, but I have to say I enjoyed them. Most of them are 3.5 to 4 stars, and I have a bunch more that I have to get through this month as well. So just very quickly, 2 of the other books that I talked about in the Scary Sleepover Weekend wrap-up were Final Friends Book 1, The Party. So I have all 3 books in this bind-up, and I was saying that I was going to try to get to the other 2 books before the end of the month, but I didn't. I just, you know, the first book in this little mini-series by Christopher Pike, I didn't really enjoy all that much. Like the ending turned out to be okay, and I know it spent a lot of time setting up the characters and setting up the storyline and all of that, but when it came down to it, I just didn't want to pick up the other ones. So I'm going to put this one back on the shelf, and I'll get to the other 2 books in the series another time. I just wasn't really in the mood to pick it up again. And then the other book that I read was Frozen Charlotte by Alex Bell. So this was a reread for me, and I read this as part of Amy McCaw's YA book club, and actually, by the time you guys are seeing this, it'll already be up on Amy's channel. I am participating in a live discussion of this book. It's a spoiler discussion, so if you guys have read it, go over and check that out. But this is fantastic. It's about a family who is living in an old, crumbly mansion on the Isle of Skye that used to be a school for kind of delinquent girls. Or troublemakers, I guess you would say. And there's creepy dolls. These Frozen Charlotte dolls are up to all kinds of no good. And this is a favorite for me of all time. I gave it a full 5 stars, both the first time I read it and the second time I read it, which was last month. It's just such a good book. If you like kind of haunting stories, if you like creepy dolls, sort of that fast-paced thriller, I would highly recommend this. And I have to say, even for a YA book, this can get pretty sinister in some spots. And it says on the front, "We're waiting for you to come and play." They play all kinds of crazy games, like stick a needle in your eye game and push the teacher down the stairs game. That's all I'm going to give away, but these creepy dolls are up to absolutely no good. And then moving on to an adult horror, so I also read Maggie's Grave by David Sodergren. And along the same lines of Frozen Charlotte, this has a lot of sort of local legends of the UK wrapped into it. This takes place in a Scottish town of Auchinmullen, and I know I'm mispronouncing that, I'm so sorry. So this revolves around a very popular local legend there about Maggie Wall, and Maggie's grave actually does exist there. And written on the grave, it says Maggie Wall buried here as a witch with the year 1657. So this is a fictional account of kind of present day when these kids get up to no good. When I say kids, I mean like older teenagers into early 20s, get up to no good, and they summon the witch back. And this, you know, what happened to Maggie, the depiction of what happened to Maggie back in the day was just so heart-wrenching, and it is a fictional account again, but it was so well written. And even though like these kids, that like it was pretty gruesome, like she's a vengeful witch and she basically comes back and she's after these kids that had brought her back from her grave. It's gruesome. It's very gruesome. It's, you know, very bloody. But at the same time, this woman, Maggie Wall, was just brutalized back in 1657 as a witch. And so you're kind of torn between, like, you know, what she's doing to these kids, but also like what happened to her back in the day, you know, the vengeful witch story. And this is so good. This and this one, actually, and another one here, the prequel to Frozen Charlotte, all three of them are favorites of all time. So this was a reread, so I knew that I was going to enjoy this one, but this one absolutely blew me out of the water. It was gross, it was heart-wrenching, it was all of the things, it was surprising, it had a great twist. I just loved this story from cover to cover. I think I read it in 2 days. And if you haven't picked this one up yet, I highly, highly recommend it. It's definitely 18 plus. And usually I don't like a whole lot of body horror in my literature. I go for more of the spooky, creepy sort of side of horror, but I gotta say this one was just fantastic, and I've found myself almost thinking about the story ever since, and I would love to go to Scotland and actually go visit Maggie's grave. I think the story was just fantastic that was written around that local legend. So speaking of Frozen Charlotte, I also read the prequel, Charlotte Says. So this one takes place in the same crumbly old mansion. So it was during the time that the girls were there for the Dunvegan School for Girls, and the Frozen Charlottes are part of that story as well. So it's kind of like the origin story of how the Frozen Charlottes got there, and it's just fantastic. Like I said, creepy dolls up to no good, and this has an antagonist in it that you hate. You hate this woman, and it's kind of like the principal of the school, and she is just written so well as an antagonist, and she's brutal, and you know, you just want her to get her comeuppance. So she's written really, really well. The creep factor is definitely in here, but it's also really brutal. Like I said, this duology is technically YA, but it can be really brutal in some spots. So favorite of all time, favorite of all time. Both of them make it on that list. Both of them are 5 stars. If you love creepy dolls, fast-paced sort of thrillers, that sort of thing, these are definitely up there, and I would highly recommend picking them up and giving them a try. So next up, I read book number 1 in A Babysitter's Guide to Monster Hunting by Joe Ballerini. And I was really hopeful for this one, and it was a super cute story, I have to say. So this is about young girls, like sort of middle grade, I think. I think the main character in here is about 14 or 15, and she's a babysitter, but she's she finds out that there's this secret society of babysitters that are actually protecting children from the monster under the bed or the monsters in their closet and stuff like this. So she is babysitting one time, and her charge ends up getting kidnapped by these monsters, and she has to go on this whole adventure to try to get him back. And it was good. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed my time with it. It was a great adventure, but it was a little bit more on the juvenile side for me. So I'm kind of like that with middle grade. A lot of them I really enjoy, but this one was, the writing was just, you know, it just felt a little bit immature for me, but still a really great story. I have to say, I think I'm going to stop here though and not go on with the rest of the series. This was a 3-star read for me. It was cute. If you have middle graders at home, I would definitely recommend it. And I'm still gonna, I think it's on Netflix. They made a show or a movie out of this, so I'm definitely gonna give that a try. And hopefully I will enjoy that just as much as I enjoyed the book. And I actually skipped over this one. It was one that I spoke in the Scary Sleepover Weekend Wrap-Up. It is The Witch of Blackbird Pond by Elizabeth George Spear. And this is a book that I've been meaning to pick up for literal years and just haven't done it. And I was kicking myself because this is another one that's on my favorite of all time list. So January, this January, I've read, what, 4 books that are on my favorite of all time list. Full 5 stars. So this revolves around a young girl named Kit, and she grew up in Barbados, and after her father dies, she comes to a very strict Puritan town in New England and has to try to meld in with that whole thing. And she's a very liberal thinking girl. Barbados was very free for her, and so she has a little bit of trouble kind of trying to fit in with this strict lifestyle. And then she befriends a Quaker woman who also lives in the community, and Quakers back then were, people were really suspicious of them. They were very much outcasts, and this woman is suspected of witchcraft. But Kit doesn't care, and she befriends her anyway. And then the long and short of it is that the woman ends up getting tried for witchcraft, and Kit finds herself wrapped up in the trial and trying to exonerate herself, trying to be a liberal thinking woman and all of that sort of thing. And this is a fantastic story. It's written really well. I listened to it on audiobook. The audiobook is narrated really well, and I would highly recommend, if you like the whole story of like the witch trials, the Salem witch trials, and all of that sort of thing. If you like classic sort of books, I would highly recommend reading this one. It was really good, and this is another one that I find myself that I keep thinking about it even after I've read it. So when a book does that to you, you know you've really enjoyed it. And again, this is probably going on my favorites of all time list. So the next book that I read was The Beautiful by Renee Ahdieh, and this is book number 1 in a duology. So I actually had both books sitting on the shelf, but I managed to only read the first one. This one didn't work out too well for me. It just wasn't my bag. So this takes place in 1872, and this follows a young woman named Celine who comes from Paris over to New Orleans. She has to flee her life as a dressmaker over there. Won't get into why or anything like that, but she has a past herself. So her and 6 other girls go to New Orleans on a boat, and they get taken in by the Ursuline nuns and live in a convent. And most of the girls get placements very quickly with teaching younger kids and stuff like that. But Celine starts to make handkerchiefs, and to try to make ends meet, she's selling them on a street corner, and she meets a very mysterious older lady who hires her to be a dressmaker for, you know, to make her a dress for a ball. And so she ends up getting into this whole underworld in New Orleans in this place called the Coeur de Lion, and there's serial murders happening. So there's a murderer, and Celine is wrapped up in all of this kind of stuff, and it's a vampire story as well. So you have serial murders, New Orleans, vampire story, late 19th century sort of thing. And it sounds so good, but there were a few things that I found were a little bit of a turnoff. So first of all, the book itself could have been cut down drastically. It was way too long. There was way too much fluff and filler. So, you know, the book was, say, about 400 pages or so. It could have been easily 200. You could have cut a lot out of there. And the other thing was Celine as a main character I found quite annoying, and she was kind of like a modern girl that was thrown into the 19th century. It's like, it didn't seem really realistic to me. And so that was kind of problematic, and it just, I think it's more for vampire lovers from the Twilight generation rather than people who love things like Anne Rice and Stoker and stuff like that, which is totally fine. It just didn't work out for me all that well. The other thing was I found it actually added to the reading experience, but there was a lot of French that was kind of throughout the conversation that they were having, the dialogue, and if you don't understand French, you might have a little bit of trouble with it because in a lot of places it didn't have a whole lot of translation. So I thought that was kind of strange for the author to do it that way because not everybody understands French. So for me, I found it to be fine because I do understand the language, and I found it added actually to the reading experience. But it could be problematic for a lot of readers. And there was actually also Spanish that was not as much as French, but it was still intertwined within the story, and I found that hard because I don't speak Spanish. So it wasn't really my thing. Like I said, I gave it 2 stars. It was a lot of drivel, I have to say, and I said the same thing in my Goodreads review. So this one fell a little flat, but you know, after having such an amazing reading month in January, you know, it was okay. I didn't really feel too upset about it, and like I said, it's not a terrible book. A lot of people might enjoy it, but it just wasn't for me. And then 2 more books to go. So the nonfiction that I read this month, and I've owned this book since I was 12 years old, and I finally picked it up again. So this is Witchcraft, The History and Mythology by Richard Marshall. So this is a fantastic book. It has all sorts of mythology from all over the world and how it's wound into the occult and witchcraft, and how early Christianity would have used that against pagans and paganism, and try to how the witch craze came about, and how the differences between the witch craze in Europe as opposed to Salem. And it's such a fantastic read, and it's fully illustrated as well. So I really enjoyed this. I loved looking at the illustrations. I loved reading the stories, the mythology and the history as well. And I really enjoyed it. So I've read this one before, like I said, but it's, you know, I think I read it a couple of times like when I was in my teens, and haven't picked it up since. So this is something that kind of just sits on my shelf and doesn't get a whole lot of attention, and I'm so glad I picked it up again. So I gave this one 4 stars, and I would highly recommend anybody picking it up and just looking at the beautiful art and everything in here, woodcuts and all sorts of things, and of course the history of witchcraft. And then the last book that I read in the month of January was this one. So this is Ghost Stories of an Antiquary Volume 2, and this is a graphic novel. So this is my first graphic novel that I've ever read, and I have to say, I can see their appeal, but I'm not sure if they're really for me. I had a fine time with this. It was great, but I would also like to read the stories, just the original stories, the way that they were meant to be read. I found that it was a little bit hard to read this just with the font that was used, and I found there was kind of a little bit of trouble with the continuity because the artwork is done by different people for different stories. So it would be kind of nice if there was, you know, kind of the same style of the artwork throughout the book, but that was just me. It was just a personal thing. So it was fine. I enjoyed it. I thought the first story in here, which is called Number 13, was really good. So these are all stories by M.R. James. I forgot to mention that. So this is a graphic, sort of illustrated account of some of his short stories. So it was great, and again, I just read this one kind of in a day while I was sitting down with my coffee. Had a good time with it. It was, you know, say 3.5 stars. It was okay, not fantastic, and I'm not sure if graphic novels are for me, or maybe I'll give another one a try down the road. So there you guys go. That is everything that I read in the month of January. It was a lot, but like I said, most of the books that I read were kind of, you know, children, middle grade, very short reads, but I really enjoyed the entire month. It was fantastic. And between Frozen Charlotte, Charlotte Says, The Witch of Blackbird Pond, Maggie's Grave, a lot of those have made it now onto my favorites of all time list, which I think is fantastic. And the other thing that I've started doing that I've really been having fun with is starting to read more classics, more Gothic literature, and I've been having a really good time with that as well. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, make sure to give me a thumbs up, leave me a question or a comment down below because you know I love chatting with you guys. But until next time, stay spooky everybody. Bye.